I want to get a boring bit of admin out of the way at the start of this video. I do not think that campaign arcs is necessarily the definitive, better version of arcs that some people might suggest that it is. I've seen a lot of community sentiment revolving around this idea that you play small arcs specifically so you can graduate to the campaign version. The base game is the chewy rind that's peeled and discarded. I do not think that is true, not one bit. These two games stand alone in their own right and are in conversation with one another. One of these games is the slimmed down competitive box that lets you really sink into the nuanced tactics in a strikingly unique science fiction setting. It's a response to Leader's previous work in a lot of ways, and might well be the most refined and competitive core box experience that they've produced. The other of these boxes is a more densely thematic and polemic box, a dizzyingly complex game that hotboxes you with strategy and waterboards you with theme. It too is a response to Leader's previous work, but it's also a simultaneous love letter and striking riposte to the space game as a whole. A messy and sprawling storytelling sandbox that's far less abstract than its squat companion. These two boxes are different propositions. Neither is necessarily better than the other. They are adjacent, they are companions, both equally deserving of their place in this hobby and on your shelves. But holy moly, if campaign arcs isn't just electric. This giant box rounds out Arcs to not just be one of the most straightforwardly excellent games yet made, but also one of the most fascinating. Let's talk about it a little. Just a little bit. Campaign arcs is broadly additive. Every single thing from the base game is present in the campaign, with a thick lather of new systems applied on top. The broad structure appears quite rote on first blush. You're going to play 3 consecutive shortened games of arcs, referred to as acts, with a board state almost entirely carried from one game to another. The person with the most points accumulated over the 3 campaign games that you play is going to be your ultimate winner, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. To set the scene thematically, here's essentially the only piece of hard, creator-driven narrative that Arcs gives you. The Empire is crumbling. Some believe this is the end, others just the beginning. In this time of chaos, new movements bloom loud like desert flowers, promising safety, liberation, communion, or simply the honor of glorious death in the struggle. What will you promise? What is your fate? Oh boy, what is your fate indeed? Let's get right into the weeds and talk about Arcs' equal parts inspired and unhinged fates system. In Act 1, each player gets a random fate to play as, and a thick stack of cards to go with it. Each of these generous servings will contain all kinds of stuff. New friends that'll live in your tableau, new tokens and systems specific to that fate, new rules and restrictions that get added to the game, before you hit a stop here card that teases future goodies to come in subsequent games. Let's take the Caretaker as an example, because he's one of the simplest to explain and just the cutest little guy the galaxy has to offer. This round friend adds new Golem tokens to the game, sentient rock things who the Caretaker has to hop around the galaxy, waking up and rescuing. They've each got powers that you can harness to serve your own ends. The Seeker lets you catapult around the map, the Harvester collects resources, the Protector heals ships, and the Warrior breaks them. Unfortunately, their power is fleeting. The player using those golems must give them away to someone else once they've helped them out, but the Caretaker themselves has got a golem hearth where their planetoid pals can always return to rest. Charming! To cement this new role, we have an objective marker that sits at the bottom of the board. Each time the Caretaker does something in character, in this case rescuing golems and using their powers, they tick down on this track. Getting that ticker to 0 completes their objective, which in turn means they get to keep playing as that fate in Act 2. Not completing that objective incurs a point penalty, but it also makes them change. But that's nothing special. It all seems pretty standard so far, right?
Oh buddy, we haven't even started.
Before we talk more about the fates, I should explain how this board looks just a little bit different to how it does in the base game. At the start of Act 1, all players are crammed into just 2 clusters on the map, with the rest of it caked in blight, this fungal alien species that coats every system outside of your starting slice. Blight, frankly, sucks. It slows down your movement, it damages ships that get too close, it generally clogs up the board in ways that make jetting off into this inky black unknown feel pioneering and dangerous. It's a pain, but there's a simple solution. Enter the Empire, a unifying faction that everyone starts as a regent of, regardless of their fate. The Empire's presence on the board is conveyed through these robust purple ships that any given player can use on their turn as part of their fleet, provided they are still part of the Empire. If you want to step into unexplored territory rife with blight, you can do so with a purple ship that'll defend you from anything that might get in your way. Excellent! More ships and free protection at no cost? Well, there are some costs. Sure, the Empire will help you in charting new territory, but also players under the watchful eye of the Empire can't harm each other in any way. They can't fight, they can't tax each other, they've got to play nice. That's maybe useful, it's situationally useful, it's certainly one less thing to worry about, but there's nothing stopping savvy players from engaging in some fisticuffs when daddy's not watching. I wanted to interrupt this section of the video with a brief PSA. When I was teaching campaign arcs, I introduced the rule of players not being able to harm each other around Empire ships as do not misbehave when daddy is watching. Never have I more regretted adding what I thought was some fun flavor to a teach in my life. These purple ships are now just called Daddy. The Empire is referred to as being part of Daddy. Achieving something on behalf of the Empire? You better be doing it for Daddy. It's a bit of language irreversibly baked into my players' collective vernacular. Please, daddy responsibly. On top of restricting who can hurt who and where, the Empire also requires players to engage in its more specific bureaucracies. Occasionally, the Empire requires its regents to prove their commitment. Every few rounds of play, they'll require a small membership fee, taking the form of resources that will sit in this Imperial treasury. Oh, you haven't got the funds right now? Don't worry, that's fine. The Empire's just going to take a favour from you, a one-off bargaining chip that it can use later on to callously repossess anything you might have. But that's fine, right? Everyone pays equally into a system that upholds the law for everyone universally. It's beneficial for everyone, right? Well, not quite. The First Regent is a grandiose title held by one particular player. They're not the Emperor themselves, but rather the prime bureaucrat tasked with upholding this particular section of the Reach. They're assistant manager coded, not necessarily doing any more work than the folks on the floor, in fact, largely doing less, but they reap the rewards all the same, because everything you're paying to exist as part of the Empire functionally goes directly to them. This begins to form something of a delicate political balance. The Empire requires bodies to function, but a greedy First Regent risks rebellion. They want to have an invisible power, not the kind that's so intrusive that a jealous regent decides to make a bid for their throne and soaks up all of their fun. Now, you can work within the Empire, sure, but also leaving it entirely is a tantalizing prospect. Disgruntled regents can elect to become outlaws if they've had enough, shrugging off the weight of the system. The thing is, upping sticks and walking out not only denies you access to those Imperial ships that were so useful for jetting off into the unknown, but also makes you a prime target for smacking from the entity you just so proudly ceded from. Cool, this really is one of those games where like this individual system could be a whole game in and of itself, but it's just the start. It's wild. So with the Empire and Blight in mind, we can touch on how these other fates might interact with these systems. The Founder is all about establishing a commonwealth, a better form of governance that'll fix the imbalances of Empire. The Steward is their polar opposite and thoroughly believes the Order of Empire is the only solution, seeking to grow its bounds hand in hand with the Admiral, a fleet commander driven by the need to flex military might and establish dominance. But outside of them, there are the Freaks. The Believer sticks out the most, a quivering mass of eyes and hair whose fervent followers whisper of a chosen one's return. The Magnate is a colossal insect driven by hoarding impulses. And the Partisan, well, I actually don't really know what their deal is. I think they're kind of just a d***. Each one brings character through the sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce alterations they make to the fabric of the game. The Founder springs up at 3 cities across the map, a wild growth. The Magnate really does vacuum up those resources, playing their own personal trading game, and the Believer replaces the cards in the trick-taking game with their own unique, double-sided suit. They are wild and experimental additions to the game, adding buckets of character and flavor, with some of the more disruptive and strange fates almost bordering on the line of mini expansions in and of themselves. Alright, so you're presented with some radical asymmetry right off the bat. It's Root again, but in space. What gives? Well, this is where it gets a little weirder. Fates that achieve their goal proceed down their prescribed narrative path, flipping more cards from the deck that get added into either their personal tableau or the card market that everyone's buying from. Let's stick with the Caretaker as our example here. They wake up the golems in Act 1, and then everything starts going a bit wrong. Act 2 has them add a clutch of malfunctions into the court deck, event cards that cause golems controlled by players to randomly do the opposite of their effect. The Protector now damages, the Warrior repairs, the Harvester gobbles your resources, and the Seeker flings you off to a random point in the galaxy. In fact, these malfunctions are so impactful and dangerous that the Caretaker's responsibility in Act 3 is to decommission those golems, removing them from the game one by one. So that is already exciting, a prescribed narrative arc, to follow from game to game to game. But Arcs is perhaps even more interested in what happens not when you succeed, but when you fail. If you do not succeed in pursuing your fate, then you don't get to keep playing as them in Act 2, you instead choose a new fate. But not one of the fates that I already told you about, don't worry, that's merely the 8 different fates that are included in the A deck. No, for Act 2, you're going to take a brand new fate from the B deck. These fates have their own stack of cards, their own personalities and narratives and goals and game-changing powers. The Pathfinder, who seeks a way out of the Reach through an interdimensional portal, the location of which you determine through a deduction minigame that you play whilst also managing the standard turn-by-turn of Arcs. The Pirate, who seeks to ransack and steal their way to a mighty hoard of treasure they store in some pocket dimension. The Hegemon, whose only language is cruelty, zipping around the map to battle standards planted on scorched planets. The Pacifist, who just wants to spread good vibes, man, and the Planet Breaker, who wants to spend the game building a giant cannon that will, well, do exactly what you'd expect. It is madness, even more strange rule sets to internalize and play through, even more character and oddball paths to victory. So right, you're the Caretaker and you mess up your Act 1, so you have to choose a new fate and you become the Pathfinder. But then you fail to find the portal that you promised. What happens then? You know where this is going. You know exactly where it's going. You pick a C fate from the C deck and you play an entirely different role in the 3rd act. And guess what? These fates have their own set of cards, their own personalities, their own narratives and goals and game-changing powers. The Gate Wraith, who wants to rip a hole in space and travel to the Twisted Passage, this game's version of the afterlife? The Survivalist, whose paranoia drives them to capturing civilians and entombing them in bunkers. The Naturalist, who wants to live in harmony with the Blight, and the Conspirator, who places bids on which player will win which ambition every round because they planned it all from the start. It is a dizzying amount of variety and asymmetry, 24 different fates that will fundamentally shake up your campaign from game to game. And it would be a lot of variety and spice if each of those fates was fully standalone, a character that you play for one game and then move on, or not. What's remarkable about arcs is that this system is so sparingly destructive. You keep almost everything you had when you switch from one fate to another. It's a purely additive system, building up and fleshing out your character based on their successes and failures, all they were and all they will be. Over 3 games, you build a history. Your tableau is your character sheet. The fate system would feel just awful if failing your fate meant that you spent the next 2 games on the back foot playing catch-up, but the game offers you olive branches every single time you switch. A card that makes everyone yelp with its scary implications, a chance to repopulate your fleet, or a chunky, upgradable flagship piece that juts out from the board and changes your entire game. These are so cool, but I'm not going to explain them properly because I've seen how much script I have left to film and I don't want this video to last like multiple hours, so we're gonna keep going. We're gonna keep going, but they are pretty damn cool. But narratively too, this game wants to tell the stories of failures, of underdogs. It knows that pure Goliath stories are not going to be interesting ones. It wants to create a few Davids to even up the scales just a little bit, to build these jagged narratives out of success and failure both. Progressing through each act as an A fate leads to something of a predetermined build that's very satisfying to play through, sure, but the most interesting combinations come through failure. They come from melding different fates together into something of a Frankenstein's monster. What does an admiral turned pirate look like? Or a hegemon turned gate wraith? The answers to these combinations are going to come out through your play, and they will tell an interesting story every time. But it's not just you that these fates impact. None of them relegate their power to just the area in front of them. They also inject spice into everyone's game, both in the present and long after they're gone. The believer, whose faithful disciples spread through the actual trick-taking part of the game, their messed up cards are going to stick around in the action deck for all 3 games, long after they're potentially gone. The golems continue to roam free without the caretaker to corral them. The warden's feudal vassalage system annoys everyone until the bitter end. In the 2022 Kickstarter for this game, there's a GIF, about halfway down the page. It's got some arrows charting a constellation course through a network of stars, wheeling and folding around on each other. Funnily enough, I think that this single animation is the best encapsulation of Arcs' fate system, and whilst so much changed about the game over the course of development, this remained. It is a game of characters that build and overlap and change in different and surprising ways every single time. And it's easy to get caught up in what you're doing in a game of Arcs, what your specific fate is, what your goals are. But this game is interested in more than that. It wants you to play in the small scale, sure, but it also wants you to think in widescreen. That bigger picture is a huge part of what I think makes this game so unbelievably special. But before we can get to that, a brief aside, where we talk about the mess. Alright, here's where boring practical Tom comes out, though this was a weird section of the video to write because I kind of disagree with it. It's more of a PSA than criticism. Let me explain. Campaign Arcs has all of the weirdness of Leader's catalogue. It has the generative narrative. It has the strange asymmetries that you've come to expect from this publisher. But my goodness, if here more than ever, that does not come with the mess. Before you even start playing Campaign Arcs, you have to have a grasp on the base game so firm it crushes. The manual recommends at least 1 game before touching the campaign, but honestly, I'd recommend at least 3. The trick-taking core of Arcs is absolutely magic, but it does take a good while to get your head around its intricacies. This is one of its finest features as a long-term competitive prospect, but before engaging with the campaign, you have to speak its language fluently, because if you don't have a good handle on this stuff, the campaign game is monstrously overwhelming. The manual does say this, going as far as to call itself long and tedious if you do not play at least one game of the base game before moving on to the campaign. But obviously, that strongly worded warning hasn't stopped certain opinion havers out there playing the campaign first anyway, and then being annoyed loudly online that it was a little bit confusing. What did you expect? Don't skip the tutorial here, especially because it's not just a tutorial, it's a great standalone game that'll be most people's easily tabled option, playable in a couple of hours rather than an entire day. Everything is additive, and there is so much of it. On top of the base game, you have the Empire, you have the Blight, you have crises and edicts and summits. It's all there before you've even started to dabble with the fates and all of the weirdness that they inject into the game. Those first games are going to be messy, in sharp relief to the sleek and tactical base game that's got a lot of rules, sure, but it's very elegantly put together and causes few questions after a solid teach. Campaign arcs is absolute kitchen sink design. It is everything. Tons and tons of engaged and intelligent design, yeah, but there is just an awful lot of it. There's so many specific and odd rules interactions that I've constantly been in the Woodland Warriors Discord asking question after question. It's also going to be an intensely brittle first experience. I won our first campaign off the back of a very slight misreading of some text. I would have absolutely decimated our third campaign if I'd properly internalized a tiny nub of rules on a card that was on the opposite side of the table to me. Campaign Arcs sings harmoniously if all players around your table thoroughly internalize both their own rules and the rules of everyone else sat amongst them. But how are they going to do that through such a dense jungle of understanding, especially in their first few games? There's so much information floating around the table that's very specific in its wording and implications, and is often just physically too far away to realistically read and remember. And it can often get so busy that the sharpness of the core gets lost. The trick-taking of arcs is a stroke of genius, and yet often in my campaign games, I can find it a little muddied because of all this other stuff that's going on all the time. When playing campaign arcs, especially when teaching campaign arcs, I do not just feel like I'm spinning plates, I feel like I'm also spinning mugs, a crockpot, and an immersion blender. It is so much game, a staggering amount of game. And for some, that is a deal breaker. But for me, I just do not think it really matters. I'm so glad that Arcs exists in its two distinct forms. If you want the sharp, sleek experience, then the base game 100% is that. Campaign Arcs is a bit different. It's for freaks. It's for weirdos. It's for people who played Oath and wanted just a little bit, or maybe quite a lot, more. But more than that, I think that Campaign Arcs' complexity and nuance and mess is what actually allows my favourite aspect of it to blossom. The slow, personal build to competitive and narrative understanding. Welcome to the rest of this review, where we're going to explore what it means for Arcs' board to not just present a game, but an ecosystem. In role-playing games, Matt has always talked about how it's easier to play a job rather than a character. People don't necessarily know how a 24-year-old dragon guy or ageless shiny elf might act in any given situation, but can more easily grasp and conceptualize the role of a paladin, or a thief, or a carpenter. Arcs' stock and trade is literally giving everyone a role to play, but that role more consciously leans towards job. You have a clear objective that drives your actions, a space in the story, but no predefined background or page-long lore document to sink into. Instead, there are just a couple short lines of flavor text on each of the fates. And for my money, it's some of the most important text in the entire game as far as getting people to play in the space that Arcs wants them to. Corner the market and dominate the reach with your commercial prowess. Restore the strength of the Empire's fleet and claim your rightful throne. For the sake of peace, we must eliminate the tools of suffering. Blight is beautiful. All it needs is a patient gardener. Despite all of the decadence in the rules you might actually have to pass, in the relative complexity of the fate that you are playing, this tiny line of text is a guiding star on how you ought to behave, in how you ought to play in any given campaign. These roles allow broader expressions than just get a big cannon and blow stuff up. I mean, well, that's there, but there's also build up a pirate horde, establish a feudal vassalage system, create a new religion, or predict who will win and steal it from them, or make the fungus your friends. These are already an engaging spritz of not just mechanical asymmetry, but asymmetry of narrative purpose. The trick here, though, the point that I'm ultimately getting at, is that these ideals aren't necessarily at odds with one another. They are far from mutually exclusive ideas about how the Reach should be. Your Act 1 board state can present you a highly dysfunctional ecosystem where players' motivations do not intersect in the slightest, or it can present a totally harmonious balance where everyone gets on with their job and potters around stress-free. It's far more likely to be somewhere in the middle, though. Maybe two Empire-forward players struggle for dominance, whilst the founder sets up their Commonwealth in a corner, and the caretaker just wanders around looking at rocks or something. And what this boils down to mechanically is that Campaign Arcs is not a game in which you engage in warfare because you are enemies by necessity and fighting gets you points. It is, rather, a game where different ideologies clash or cooperate, and the battles that they fight are more than merely military. There's little reason for most fates to go and destroy the Magnate arbitrarily over their physical board presence, unless their wealth-hoarding tendencies prove a juicy target for a founder trying to get their new status quo off the ground. Or maybe the Empire will need to keep them in check if they start taking tithes from worlds that aren't theirs. The Pathfinder can seek their portal peacefully, but it might be a problem for an admiral when their seat of power is parked right on top of it. These interactions are too numerous to summarize, but every fate can have a totally different relationship to another based on both player proclivities and which other fates are present. But it isn't static. Each game does not merely present one specific scenario to play in. It shifts and changes across 10 whole chapters of play. In stark contrast to the base game, good play is not just measured in individual action efficiencies and clean decision-making, but rather in being wary of those subtle shifts in climate, of looking at the bigger picture, of seeing how belief is shifting in your campaign. The Reach is not just a setting, it's not just a board, it's another character around your table. Arcs is a chatty game, in that it's in conversation with a whole bunch of other things, but one sticks out to me as the most important of all. This may well be wildly off base, but I find Arcs to be a simultaneous love letter and riposte to Twilight Imperium, the plastic classic that's been stuck in board gamers' brains ever since its first edition in 1997, sticking around all the way up to its 4th edition in 2017, a 20-plus year legacy of blasting your friends to bits in space. Twilight Imperium is a foundational text for a lot of board gamers, many's first exposure to a game of its size, complexity, and fantasy. To be absolutely clear, I love Twilight Imperium. It's one of the very first games that really got me hooked on this hobby, hooked on the excitement that comes with a weekend filled with cardboard, plastic, and rules. But I do feel as though it's been somewhat held aloft by the imaginative space in between the rules, the potential of what it could be rather than what it physically, practically is. To me, the fantasy of Twilight Imperium often falls short of the game itself. Its aspirations of space opera can very readily shift into that of a space dirge, with hours and hours of play sacrificed on the altar of giant fleets taking on incalculable dice battles that span far too long, replacing the excitement of Machiavellian scheming and politicking. Arcs, I think, capitalizes on that missed potential. It fills those gaps and then some. Practically, it's preferable to my tastes across a number of different axes. As a turn-by-turn experience, it is far less sluggish, more immediate and reactive and tense. For my money, it is simply a better game, condensing the entirety of the experience into a much more achievable package. Far more importantly, though, Twilight Imperium sells you on a galaxy packed with possibilities, with tension, with stories. But almost all of those stories are about conquest, colonization, and dominance. That is by design. Of course, Twilight Imperium wants to be a 4X game, obviously. But campaign arcs gain so much more by not treading that tired path and electing to choose more varied verbs. Its combat is rich and tactical, sure, but the game is also pleased to make moving around the board without direct conflict a more three-dimensional puzzle. It makes political battles feel more freewheeling and imaginative than TI's comparatively blunt political phase. Power is projected across many different axes. Resources are more than just tools for violence. But the specific area in which it blows TI out of the water is that it mechanically allows player relationships to be far more developed, complex, and interesting. Arcs doesn't see its galaxy as a black void pocked with planets on which to impose control and enact violence, but rather a flexible web of personalities and beliefs, a player-driven ecosystem. I think this is best illustrated with those sea fates that I've deliberately underexplained in this review. Whilst the A and B fates from Acts 1 and 2 have straightforward ways to get points across all three games, culminating in a grand ambition in Game 3 that will score them a boatload of points for every round they achieve it, Sea Fates are a little different. They don't have one of those grand ambitions. In Game 3, they still have a straightforward objective with one tiny twist. If they complete that objective in your third game, they win your whole campaign then and there. This is huge, it's radical, it's frankly a little bit ridiculous. I can imagine a lot of players being turned off by this design decision alone. The idea that all of your points over all three games mean absolutely nothing in the face of one player succeeding an objective at the last minute? I get it, I understand that, it seems crazy, but stick with me, because I think this design decision tips Arcs' hand as to how it wants its players to conceptualize any given campaign. You see, the typical mode of engagement with other players in space games is beating. It's reducing options and taking away and decimating board positions and conquering as much of the map as you can get your mitts on. In our first few Arcs campaigns, we were playing the game like Twilight Imperium. We were playing a game where conquering another straightforwardly meant victory, deliberately blocking people from completing their objectives because that was a win in our book. Them not having was as good as us, well, having. This is just not the case in Arcs, where cooperation, not just an uneasy alliance, but full-fledged cooperation, is just as valid a tool as conflict. We saw this game as one where stopping another player's objective was by necessity a good thing. You were removing another powerful faction from the game, but you just aren't. It is a bad idea, especially for the A fates. The Sea Fates are so destructive and weird and unpredictable in Act 3 that having just one is scary. Having multiple is a danger to everyone's game state. If you're going into Act 3 as a faction that has been so dominant that everyone else has had to switch to a Sea Fate under your oppressive regime, you are losing. You can't put out 3 fires at once and your empire is destined to fall. The theming on the Sea Fates is just delightful. They're villainous and antagonistic, but rarely in a straightforward way. These fates are the symptom of what you have done to the galaxy. They are the friction that simmers on the seams of ideology. Take the Survivalist, for example. Their fate is to build bunkers across the Reach in order to shelter everyone from the Blight. And that appears a noble goal, until you realize they fill those bunkers by taking captives. planets. The Edengard ambition is about controlling and protecting fuel and material planets that have presumably been strip-mined and blasted to pieces by the third act of your campaign. They're an ecologically minded faction that wants to lock all those ill-gotten natural resources in a great green vault. Again, on paper, a noble goal, but in our most recent campaign, the player piloting them got those resources by raiding free cities, blasting them from the map, engaging in eco-terrorism. The Sea Fates are deeply shamed and vengeful for what's happened to them, but their existence is the result of every player's cumulative decision-making. You created those fates. You sowed the seeds for them to flourish. They are your fault, and you must sit with the consequences. There's a final piece of the puzzle here. I haven't talked about the summit at all in this review, but there's a whole negotiation phase in this game where you can swap things around in a bit of freewheeling trade, usually at least once per chapter. Players can exchange resources, ships, cities, and promises for future actions later on at the summit, a blast of creative freedom within a quite systemic game. I mention the summit because it's a radical point of divergence in one of our most recent games, a game that really stood out to me and threw what Arx was into sharp relief. Two powerful fates, the Admiral with their vast board presence and the Warden with their vassalage system, were trying their darndest to stop the Planet Breaker from, well, breaking a planet. The fourth player, the Pacifist, watched helplessly from the sidelines. The whole table was corralling the Admiral to do something about the Planet Breaker. If they were to break a planet successfully, it would cause everyone around the table to provoke outrage of the type of planet that was destroyed, effectively binning off a huge number of very powerful cards from the game. The Admiral, courting popular opinion, chose to do the right thing with their military might and defeat the Planet Breaker. They strolled up to them and blasted the living daylights out of their fleet in 2 consecutive turns of bloody battle. They then followed this with a summit in which they called in all of their favors to put the nail in the coffin in the Admiral's board position, removing huge swathes of their fleet from the board in that conflict and back at their home planet. It was pretty brutal. In doing so, however, they took a big chunk out of their own fleet, and they also used up a bunch of psionics that could have better helped the Pacifist finish their goal. But who cares about them in this moment? The Planet Breaker is literally trying to break a planet. The Pacifist and the Planet Breaker both failed their goals and had to switch to a Sea Fate for Game 3, a game that was absolute anarchy. The A and B fates were trying their best to hold on to any source of points they could, while simultaneously fighting 2 raging fires in those Sea Fates. Sea Fates that were actively collaborating with each other, willing one of them to win over these other fates that had done them so wrong. It was a nasty game state, and one of the Sea Fates, the Conspirator, ended up slamming the game shut in Chapter 2 after a few short hands of total mess. All that empire was worth nothing in the face of such a popular rebellion. Following that game, we had a lengthy conversation, one that started at the table and then spiraled out into text message chains and trips to the pub. We weren't chatting about Act 3 though, we were chatting about Act 2. The Admiral had made a blunder. They saw the Planet Breaker as the biggest threat around the table, but a threat to who? Their objectives did not necessarily conflict in any way with each other. The Planet Breaker wasn't good for the Admiral, but they certainly weren't the worst. The Admiral had caved to the pressure of the table, pushed into defeating the villainous fate with their bad goal, but in reality, they weren't the biggest problem. In truth, the Planet Breaker's absence would only explicitly help the other 2 players at the table, the conflict-averse Warden and Pacifist. In fact, the Pacifists readily admitted that they would help the Warden in Game 3. Their objectives were symbiotic. The Warden didn't want conflict to occur in their fiefs. What better way to ensure that than disallowing conflict completely? In the summit preceding this big conflict, we reckon that the Admiral should have gifted their entire arsenal of weapons over to the Planet Breaker, directly funding their goal and turning their attention to the real danger, the Pacifist, the person round the table who it was safe to turn into a Sea Fate. The Admiral should have given up points and resources then and there in order to create a better game state for themselves in Game 3. That reality is far more preferable to facing multiple sea fates in the same game. Far better to have the whole table keep one in check. The Admiral should have balanced the ecosystem. The best solution to those sea fates is not to prevent them entirely, but to have a table that selectively fosters them. Arx reinforces within its design that annihilation does not a victory make, it breeds disruption. And disruption is dangerous to the status quo. If you are the Empire, you want to feed those rival fates hope. You want to ally with that disruptive force. You want to give them the chance to beat you on your own terms before crushing them to pieces in the final act. In what other mass market game do you have such dark political intricacies of a huge empire directly funding insurgent terrorists because they know that their existence is futile, that ultimately their presence will serve the status quo, not hinder it? This is a game of deeply complex player politics with reams of real-world analogy. A campaign of Arx does not relegate its space fantasy to stories of how one house best obliterates another. It reaches for more salient fruit. Its fantasies are far more complex and engaged. They explore how a powerful empire might ally with a resource-driven magnate to feed itself with the power it needs to maintain control. How an eco-terrorist might ride the coattails of new religion to push deeply unpopular reforms. How a tyrant is toppled by ancient machinery and a fungal messiah. So Arx is in conversation with TI in how it might best display its space opera stories on your table. But it's not just a game that exists in the relief of another, but rather its own cumulative obelisk. Arx did not instantly appear fully formed at the single hand of one auteur designer, but rather came to be over years and years of design legacy, of work not just on itself, but across a whole catalogue of deeply strange games. This is a game made in conversation with every leader and whirly game before it. Within this box are vast Ahoy and Roots radical asymmetries, Oath's legacy-light memory and power dynamics of Empire and Exile. In here are Pax Pamir's personality-packed tableaus and John Company's particular blend of negotiation and uneasy alliances. This is a game that comes from not just a designer, but an entire studio firing on all cylinders at the very top of their game, reflecting on a history of atypical games and how they have succeeded and stumbled. It's been a bit of a joke within and outside of the site recently that I won't stop talking about Arx, but it's because I'm so enraptured with it as a game that I see myself sticking with it far longer than any other in my collection. As reviewers, and often as consumers, we're pulled along by the tide of novelty. We play a game for a good chunk of time and then by necessity have to move on to pastures new, often quicker than we might like to. After playing this game at least once, probably twice, and often 3 times a week for the past few months, I'm not slowing down. And I hope that Leader don't either. I hope this game gets huge. It deserves it, and I hope this review can be just a tiny drop in the pond of making that reality possible. When I started working for Shut Up and Sit Down, I was really excited about board games, but often a lot of what I was playing in the present wasn't quite on the same level as the older classics that I would routinely get shown. When I was looking for games to review, I was continually playing stuff that was really, really good, but I was just worried that it wasn't quite as weird or impactful or foundational as, say, Food Chain Magnate, or Tigris and Euphrates, or Gloomhaven, or Blood on the Clock Tower. And I've covered a hell of a lot of games now for Shut Up and Sit Down, a good chunk of them that I do think are on the same level as those games. But I've never truly felt confident in staking a claim that any given box is better than them. I'm just so glad that I get to do my job right now, that I get to be an advocate for this hobby, that I get to be an advocate for this game, because Arx isn't just on par with that list of stone cold classics, it exceeds them. It is every bit the game as those boxes, and deeply engaged too with its themes. Accessible but academic, polemic with no compromise to its turn-by-turn enjoyment, straddling every mode of play from quick and breezy to weekend-fillingly chunky. Not a single one of my players hasn't come away from this game faintly or fully smitten. It gives me such a warm feeling to so definitively bat for a game made with such love and passion and excitement for board games. If you would like more videos like this from Shut Up and Sit Down, then please consider supporting us through our website or our Patreon. These videos were a huge project, and support from donors is what makes any of it possible. Support from donors is what enables us to create videos that are thoughtful and interesting explorations of the board games that we like to play, free from any other apparatus around them. What we make is for you. Thank you so much for supporting the site, either in the past or in the present or sometime in the future. Donating to the site this month gets you access to the review errata video that I'm going to make for ARX. That'll be available in August, and it will go over all of the things that I left out of the review for time. I think there's some juicy stuff in there, and I think it will be a good, fun little video. That's it. I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I enjoyed making it. Thank you so much for being here. See you next time.